in my work with leaders recently, I hear more and more frustration and concern and upset expressed by people in leadership roles about what they're doing and what's occurring as a result of their actions. More and more leaders describe a feeling of frustration, of anxiety, of concern, of worry about the impact of their work, about the value of their work, in fact. So I become very aware that being a leader is a challenging job role at this current point in time. And it also has a lot to do with whether leaders feel credible, because more and more I hear leaders expressing their frustration by saying things like, I just don't feel credible. I wish I felt more credible as a leader. I don't have a feeling of credibility. So that's why we've taken on this topic and why we're approaching this topic today. So let's talk about what leadership credibility, in fact, is. When I've asked leaders over the year to talk about their impressions of what we're calling credibility, I've heard them describe it based on behaviors that they think communicate, trust, respect, believability, some kind of positive influence, and clearly the ability to have visible impact. Now, if those in fact are legitimate and reliable markers of credibility, then the great question is, are there conditions for success to achieve credibility? Is there a key criterion that would determine credibility? And I've come to think that maybe the correct response to that is perhaps. And here's a possibility. So let's start with a story. I'm going to share a couple of stories. So it's an coaching session with a long-term coaching client of mine, an executive vice president of a large manufacturing organization who was the leader of a very successful leadership team. Over the years, in my work with this particular leader, I've had occasion to talk with him about his experience of working with his senior leadership team, and it was always a conversation that seemed to go well. Things seemed to be productive. The team seemed to be doing good work. My client was happy and comfortable with the way he seemed to be dealing with them and managing them and encouraging them in their efforts to do the right thing. Anyway, all seemed to be going well. And then suddenly they didn't. And in his conversations with me, he began to cite a number of different troubles that seemed to be simmering under the surface or bubbling up into his awareness. And he described things like, conflict between team members, a feeling of mistrust that members were experiencing and sharing with one another, disrespect for one another, something that had never occurred in the past, and then just problems working with, poor collaboration, poor collaborative skills. So what was occurring overall was that team members were beginning to experience and begin to openly talk about what they felt was a breakdown in the credibility of their leadership team. So as I took a step back and was reflecting on what this leader was sharing with me and his level of discomfort and concern, the first question I asked him was, well, oftentimes in situations where it's important to create a sense of unification and clarity and alignment in a leadership team, people develop team norms, rules of the road, operating principles, guidelines for success. In other words, they generate together a selected group of behaviors that will demonstrate their shared commitment to a kind of a unified approach. So I asked my client, are those in place? Do you have those? Do you have rules of the road? Do you have operating principles? And he looked at me and he said, well, of course we do. Sure, of course we do. And in fact, we've had them printed. And many of my team members, my leadership team members, have them in their offices, posted in their offices. And he said, and he shook his head and said, we have them. And they're there, but they don't seem to be having the impact that they should. And I took a step back and I said, well, all right, okay, you're not happy. You have these structures in place that should be guiding people toward the kind of behavior you say you and they want. What do you think is the problem? Well, my client himself then took a step back and reflected on my question. And all of a sudden, it was strange. It was as if a light bulb went off suddenly. And he turned to me and he said, we don't practice what we preach. We know what we've agreed to, but we don't practice those behaviors. Well, I heard that and a light bulb went off for me, and I thought there's real value in that awareness, and I have to figure out how to help my client use that awareness in his own behalf and to help his team move through this period. So hold that thought. Now, then I'll move to another story. And this is a story involving an organization that I'm sure most of you are familiar with because it's one of the United States' most famous corporate settings. It's IBM, the International Business Machines. And this is a story that involves its founder and first CEO, Tom Watson. And in fact, this is a story that made the rounds in IBM. So in this story, it involves Tom Watson Sr. having given a fairly new recruit to his senior leadership team an assignment to open a big new piece of business in South America. And this new leader had gone off feeling very clear and comfortable, had his marching orders, knew what he thought he was supposed to do, went off to do it, and had a terrible experience. Things just went sideways badly. And he lost a lot of money, almost $1 million. So he returns from this very failed venture with his tail between his legs, feeling, as you might imagine, absolutely awful. And not surprisingly, Tom Watson calls him into his office for a debrief. Vice President finishes his debrief with Tom Watson. Watson apparently is satisfied, takes off his glasses, puts them on his desk, looks the young senior vice president in the eye and says, "Well, thanks. That was, I think, a very productive conversation. I really appreciate your clarity and your honesty and your willingness to go through this." He said, "I think we're done. You can go." So the senior vice president kind of shakily got to his feet and kind of turned to go. And he turned back and he said, "Mr. Watson, I assume that this probably is the end of my tenure with IBM. I assume you're terminating me. You're firing me." And Watson couldn't have looked more surprised and astonished. And he said, "Wait a minute, fire you? Fire you? We've just spent $1 million training you." And that story, as you might imagine, formed also a very clear foundational dynamic in the experiences that people hear about when they join IBM, the fact that it's fine to make mistakes as long as you learn from them. So one of the things I wanted to give you an opportunity to do was to take a breath, take a beat, take a moment, and reflect on whether you've had a similar experience with a person like Tom Watson in your life. Is there an icon in your life, an exemplar, a person who you noticed and clearly observed practicing what they preached? That is, someone whose behavior aligned with their values, as Tom Watson's did. I mean, IBM's culture demands that mistakes, thoughtful mistakes, are tolerable. Clearly, Watson practiced what he preached. Is there anybody in your leadership life or experience who would be a Tom Watson, someone you've noticed, someone who's practiced what they preach? And in fact, as you think about that for a minute or so, think about specifically what did they do? And what is congruence? How do you recognize it? Well, you recognize it when external behavior reflects internal core values. What people do is clearly aligned with what they say they believe in. If they have core principles, you know what they are because they put them into action. That is congruence. And that's what we're really here to take a moment to explore together today. Because my conclusion is that congruence, that is the match between what I say I believe and what I believe my core principles and inner commitments are, and what then I do to put them into action, reflects congruence. And in fact, is the primary driver of what I'm calling leadership credibility. That leadership credibility demands or requires congruence, this match that we're talking about. So now let's spend a moment just talking about the origins of congruence. Where does it come from? Well, one of the things I want to be very clear is that I don't think congruence is based on either competency or skill. It's not, while it is about doing something that is in alignment with principle, with value, it is not about a particular skill. It's not something that can be developed as a separate skill because it's not about performing or about doing. Instead, I think that it's a reflection of internal character and internal will, that it's a reflection of who we are, not what we've learned how to do. So it's really an internal resource. That congruence is an internal resource that we see being embodied from the inside out. So again, of course, the question is, well, why should we care? Should we care about a leader's congruence? And my answer, of course, is a resounding yes, you betcha, because it creates trust and respect and admiration. When leaders are congruent, those are the consequences, because it also nurtures a word that is used to define our awareness of a person's congruence. And that word is integrity. When we say that someone has integrity or a leader is behaving with integrity, what we're really saying, of course, is that that person is behaving in a way that is congruent. And so as a result, what congruence leads to is ultimately credibility on the part of a leader. In fact, it's the most powerful source of credibility for a leader. Now, one of the interesting questions is there then a shadow side to congruence? If there are all the positive markers of congruence, if we should be aspiring to be in alignment with our intention to be congruent, that is, to put our values into action, to align our behavior with our inner principles, um, is there a way of noticing when that isn't happening, when there is a breakdown? Is there a shadow side? And yes, there is. And I think, in fact, we know it because we tend to talk about it openly. Just as we use the word integrity to demonstrate our awareness that someone is behaving in congruence with congruence, if someone is behaving incongruently or out of alignment with congruence, we use the word hypocrisy. We refer to those people as hypocrites. They absolutely do not practice what they preach. And we know it, and we can actively see it, name it, criticize it. How do you embody congruence? And here's the question for you, and here's the question for our next interlude. Do you practice what you preach? Do you put your own personal inner commitments into action? Do you feel that you are credible to yourself and to other people around you whose opinion you value? So now your task is to take just a brief moment and to notice and to see if you can name your own personal inner commitments, your own inner operating principles. Take a minute. I hope you've been able to articulate a few of the important ways in which you demonstrate congruence to yourself, that you've been able to identify some key inner commitments. Just as an example, I'm going to share with you some of my own, and I hope that they have some relevance to you as well, for you as well. Um, I've separated my commitments into two types. There's a set of commitments I call performance commitments that I know I try to live up to. And then there are a series of commitments that I call presence commitments. That is, those kind of commitments that more or less describe how I want to be seen by others, how I want, what inferences I want other people to make about me based on the way they experience what it's like to spend time with me, to be around me, to watch me in action. So my performance commitments are three simple injunctions. And there are three injunctions that I developed after a conversation many years ago, with a much beloved colleague who took me aside and said, you know, Peter, there are only three guidelines to success in life. And those three guidelines are show up, tell the truth, and keep your agreements. And I was so taken aback by the simplicity and the clarity of those guidelines that I thought, well, this can't possibly be true. That's just, they're too few and they're too simple. Well, the more I thought about it, the more I thought, well, showing up, telling the truth, and keeping agreements, that kind of does describe a lot of the challenge that comes to you in life. To be present and to be available and to be on time, to be honest and open, and then to keep agreements, to keep commitments. Well, I think that makes a lot of sense. So I've done my very best to incorporate those three performance commitments into my life and to follow them as much as possible. And I feel pretty comfortable that most of the time I do a reasonably good job of living up to them. Now, my presence commitments are a little different because when I am around other people or in a group of people, what I hope people will say about me is that there are four of them, that I am kind, that I'm generous, that I'm patient, and that I'm humble. And I found them to be very important guidelines, very important sort of beacons or lighthouses to try to respond to. The question, of course, is always what happens if we notice that congruence has eroded, like it did in this leadership team that I used as an illustration at the beginning of this conversation, the team with my executive VP coaching client. How do we recognize breakdowns in congruence? And there are some predictable ways that congruence erodes. And I'll give you three very simplistic, but I think typical examples of eroding congruence. And the first is something I would call slow caving. That's when you've made a commitment to a particular behavior and are doing your best to follow through, but you just find yourself sort of drifting away from your intention. And oftentimes that happens in relationship to food and drink and other kinds of habits, things like having a martini or smoking or having a brownie, having a love for brownies. It's the key signal is something to the tune of, well, one more won't hurt me, one more won't hurt me, one more won't hurt me. And that, I think, is often an indication that someone is in the middle of a slow cave. There's a second example that I think is also interesting, and I refer to it as endless chipping. And that's when we made a commitment to something like keeping private things private. Let's say we have a colleague or a friend who tells us in confidence a deep truth, or something is going on, or some private information. And we've had an agreement with this friend that we're going to maintain our commitment to privacy. And yet, someone else knows that possibly we have that information. We're sitting on that information, and they, in fact, would like to know it. Well, sometimes there is a demonstration of, as I say, I call it endless chipping, where someone approaches you and says, tell me, tell me, tell me, tell me, tell me, tell me. Oh, tell me, tell me. You can tell me. You can tell me. I won't tell anybody. I'll be fine. That's fine. You can tell me. And ultimately, sometimes that drip, drip, drip wears down the commitment to maintaining that kind of congruence, where boundaries get blurred and suddenly you're not in good shape anymore. The third is an erosion that I tend to call a deal with the devil. And this is a little more, I think, of concern because oftentimes it deals with breaking regulations or possibly even rules, but sometimes even breaking the law. And here, it's the seductive pull of somebody saying, "Oh, we can get away with this. We can get away with it. We don't have to worry about it. I mean, yeah, it's illegal, it's immoral, it's wrong. We shouldn't be doing it, but we can get away with it. We can get away with it. Come on, we can get away with it." And suddenly you find yourself having made a deal with the devil. So those three kind of key categories, slow caving, endless chipping, and deals with the devil, are, I think, typical and predictable examples of erosion of congruence. But the really interesting question is not whether those kinds of challenges arise, because if you're open to seeing evidence in the world around you, you know they do. The question is, how do we respond? What do we do? That's the real key question. Is there a way that we can repair and rebuild congruence that may have eroded? I think the answer to that question is based on two preliminary points of inquiry. The 2 points of inquiry are, what do you notice about what's happening in terms of this erosion? What's going on? How do you know the erosion is occurring? And then what do you want? What do you want to replace it with? What do you want to have reinstated as an example of more congruent response or more congruent behavior? I think it can be very difficult because, as I say, congruence is based on interior clarity, interior commitment, will, character, the ability to choose to behave in a certain way because you are making an agreement with yourself. And reestablishing that agreement with yourself is sometimes challenging. The one way that sometimes works is a strategy that I've picked up from a famous Harvard psychologist and psychological researcher whose name was Jerome Bruner. And Bruner very famously said, I'm more likely to act myself into feeling than to feel myself into acting. So I think, ironically, even though congruence emerges from the inside out, sometimes I think we can rebuild it by behaving differently on the outside and feeling the impact from that choice on the inside. Doesn't always work. I make no guarantees, but I have tried it for myself, and I do think it has potential. Well, we've come to the end of this conversation, and I've had a wonderful time spending this time with you talking about a topic which is very important to me, has been very important to me as a coach and as a consultant, and I hope you found it interesting and provocative for yourselves as well. Thanks so much for your attention. I'll look forward to having a chance to chat with you about this should we ever have the pleasure and privilege of running into each other. Thanks. Bye.